23 is too old to be a virgin. That's what society says. Tessa knew it. She just didn't care. She was too busy surviving double shifts and keeping her head down to worry about fairy tales. But fairy tales twist into nightmares when your best friend's brother is Dominic Costa. He wasn't supposed to notice her. He was supposed to be a ghost in a tailored suit. Then he looked at her. The surviving stopped. The falling began. The fluorescent lights of the pharmacy always left Tessa with a dull, throbbing ache behind her eyes by the end of a 10-hour shift. Tuesday nights were the worst. The world smelled like damp wool, cheap mints, and the sharp, sterile sting of rubbing alcohol. She pushed out the glass double doors, pulling her thrifted waterproof jacket tighter around her shoulders. The rain in the city didn't fall. It spat. It coated the sidewalks in a slick, greasy film that made every step treacherous. Tessa's arches screamed in protest against her worn-out sneakers as she walked the 3 blocks to the subway. She was 23, flat broke, and entirely invisible. That was exactly how she liked it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Gemma. "Feed macaroni? I owe you my life. Keys under the fake rock." Tessa sighed, her breath pluming in the cold air. Gemma Costa was a tornado wrapped in designer labels. They had been best friends since they were 6, back before Gemma's family skyrocketed from local neighborhood muscle to the kind of untouchable wealth that bought politicians and judges. Gemma was loud, reckless, and fiercely loyal. Tessa was quiet, exhausted, and hopelessly practical. They fit together because neither demanded the other to change. Tessa altered her route, taking the subway 4 stops uptown to the neighborhood where the doormen wore actual top hats. She bypassed the lobby, slipping through the service elevator Gemma had given her a fob for. Gemma's apartment was on the 30th floor. It was a sprawling, sterile monument to new money. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the city, glittering like a wet circuit board. Tessa unlocked the door, calling out softly. "Macaroni?" The orange tabby didn't greet her. The apartment was completely dark, save for the ambient glow of the city bleeding through the glass. The air felt heavy, thick. It smelled faintly of ozone, petrichor, and something distinctly expensive, like dark cedar and tobacco. Tessa flipped the light switch. Nothing happened. "The breaker is tripped," a voice said. Tessa froze. Her heart slammed into her ribs, a violent, panicked rhythm. The voice came from the living room, deep and entirely devoid of warmth. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. And somehow that was infinitely more terrifying. She strained her eyes. A shadow detached itself from the larger shadow of Gemma's ridiculous velvet sofa. He stepped into the gray light of the window. Dominic Costa. Tessa had only seen him a handful of times in her life, usually from a distance at Gemma's extravagant birthdays or high school graduations. He was 8 years older than them. He was the brother Gemma rarely spoke about. The man who had taken over the family business when their father died of a sudden, violent heart attack. He didn't look like a mafia boss from a movie. He wore a dark, unstructured wool sweater and charcoal trousers. There were no flashy rings on his fingers, but the way he stood, perfectly still, shoulders broad, hands hanging loosely at his sides, projected an inescapable gravity. He moved like a man who knew the floorboards would hold his weight, no matter what he did. "Dominic," Tessa breathed, her hand still hovering uselessly over the dead light switch. Tessa. He knew her name. The syllables sounded strange in his mouth, raspy and low. "Gemma isn't here," she said, trying to force her vocal cords to stop vibrating. She focused on the practical, the immediate. "She asked me to feed the cat." Dominic reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver lighter. He didn't light a cigarette. He just flipped the lid open with a sharp, metallic clink. "I know she isn't here. She hasn't been here for 2 days. I came to see if she was stupid enough to leave a trail." Tessa crossed her arms, her wet jacket rustling. The fear was still there, but it was slowly being eclipsed by a bone-deep exhaustion. "And? Did she?" Dominic stepped closer. The ambient light caught his face. He looked exhausted. There were heavy bruised shadows beneath his dark eyes, and a faint shadow of stubble along his jaw. His nose was slightly crooked, a brutal imperfection on an otherwise arresting face. "No," he said softly. "She didn't. Which means someone else cleaned it up." He paused, his gaze dropping to her hands, which were picking anxiously at a frayed cuticle. "When was the last time you spoke to her?" 3 hours ago. A text." Tessa held up her phone, unlocking it and tossing it onto the kitchen island between them. It skidded and stopped right at the edge. "She asked me to feed macaroni. That's it." Dominic didn't look at the phone. He looked at Tessa. His eyes were the color of wet asphalt, unreadable and entirely too observant. "You're shivering. It's raining. You work at the pharmacy on 4th and Elm." It wasn't a question. Tessa's stomach plummeted. "You have people watching me?" "I have people watching everyone connected to my sister," Dominic corrected smoothly, leaning against the marble counter. He picked up her phone, glancing at the screen, then slid it back across the marble towards her. "You live in a studio in Queens. You pay your rent on the 1st of the month. You don't date. You don't go out. You work, you go home, and occasionally you clean up my sister's messes." Tessa's jaw tightened. She hated feeling exposed. She had spent her entire adult life building walls, making herself small and uninteresting so the world would leave her alone. Her mother had been a beautiful, tragic mess who let dangerous men ruin her life. Tessa had vowed early on to be the exact opposite. Her virginity, her isolation, her rigid routine. They weren't moral choices. They were armor. "I don't clean up her messes," Tessa said, her voice dropping a register, hardening. "I feed her cat. There's a difference. Now, if you're done reciting my biography, I'm going to open a can of tuna and go home." Silence stretched between them. The rain lashed against the thick glass of the high-rise. For a second, Tessa thought she had pushed too far. You didn't speak to a man like Dominic Costa like he was a telemarketer. But then, the corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but the heavy, suffocating tension in the room fractured just enough for her to breathe. "Go ahead, Tessa," he said quietly, stepping back into the shadows. "Feed the cat." The next afternoon, the sun refused to shine. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, hanging low and heavy over the city. Tessa was aggressively counting amoxicillin pills into a plastic tray when the bell above the pharmacy door jingled. She didn't look up immediately. "Be right with you," she muttered, using a plastic spatula to slide the pink capsules into a bottle. When she finally capped the bottle and looked up, the breath hitched in her throat. Dominic Costa was standing in the narrow aisle between the greeting cards and the compression socks. In the harsh, buzzing, fluorescent light of the pharmacy, he looked entirely out of place. He was wearing a dark, bespoke suit today, the fabric absorbing the terrible lighting. Two men in identical dark coats stood outside on the pavement, their backs to the glass door, hands clasped in front of them. The lone customer in the store, an elderly woman buying laxatives, took one look at Dominic, dropped her basket, and hurried out the door. Tessa stared at him. "You're scaring off my customers." "She looked like she remembered somewhere she needed to be," Dominic said. He walked up to the counter. Up close, the sheer size of him was overwhelming. He didn't just take up physical space, he commanded the air around him. "Your shift ended 10 minutes ago. I was finishing a prescription." Tessa wiped her hands on her blue scrubs, hyper-aware of the fact that she smelled like generic hand sanitizer, and her hair was held up by a plastic claw clip that was missing 3 teeth. "What are you doing here, Dominic?" "Gemma's phone is dead. Has been since midnight." His voice was low, meant only for her. The exhaustion she had seen the night before had morphed into a quiet, vibrating intensity. "Did she reach out?" "No." Tessa frowned, genuine worry piercing through her annoyance. Gemma was flaky, but she never went off the grid completely. She lived on social media. "Are you sure she's not just sleeping off a hangover at a hotel?" "I own the hotels she sleeps at," he said flatly. "She's not there. Get your coat." "I can't just leave," Tessa protested, gesturing to the back room. "I have to clock out, and my manager—" "Your manager," Dominic interrupted, his gaze flicking to the terrified pharmacist peeking out from the back office. "Understands that you have a family emergency, don't you, Gary?" Gary squeaked out, a panicked, "Yes, sir. Take all the time you need, Tessa." Tessa glared at Dominic. She hated the display of power. She hated how easily the world bent its knees for him. But more than that, she hated the knot of genuine terror forming in her gut about her best friend. Without another word, she grabbed her damp jacket from the hook, grabbed her bag, and walked around the counter. Dominic pushed the glass door open for her. Outside, a sleek, black SUV idled at the curb. One of the men outside opened the back door. Tessa hesitated. Getting into a car with a cartel boss was exactly the kind of thing her mother would have done. It was the first step on a road that ended in a shallow grave or a shattered life. Dominic paused, seeing her hesitation. He didn't push her. He didn't command her. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes stripping away the layers of her defensive cynicism. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said. The promise wasn't theatrical. It was a heavy, ironclad vow. "But I need you. If she runs, she'll run to you." Tessa swallowed hard, her throat clicking. She stepped into the car. The interior smelled of expensive leather and mint. The heavy thud of the door closing sealed them in a quiet, soundproof bubble, drowning out the city noise. Dominic sat beside her, leaving a respectable distance between them, but the heat radiating from his body was undeniable. The SUV merged smoothly into the slick traffic. "Why do you put up with her?" Dominic asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the thick silence. He was staring out the tinted window, watching the blur of brake lights. Tessa looked down at her hands, picking at her thumbnail. "Because when my mom died, I was 17. I had no money, no dad, and the state was going to put me in a group home. Gemma hid me in her pool house for 3 months and brought me food until I turned 18 and could sign my own lease. She kept me out of the system." Dominic slowly turned his head to look at her. The sharp angles of his face softened, just a fraction. He understood the currency of loyalty. In his world, debts were written in blood. You don't forget a debt. No, Tessa said quietly. I don't. You're a good friend, Tessa. I'm a tired friend. She leaned her head back against the leather headrest, closing her eyes for a brief second. What kind of trouble is she in, Dominic? Don't lie to me. She owes a substantial amount of money to a man who does not respect my family's territory, Dominic answered, his tone going clinical. It's a provocation. They are using her stupidity to test my patience. Tessa opened her eyes and looked at him. Are you going to kill them? Dominic didn't blink. If they have touched a single hair on her head, I will burn their entire world to the ground. The utter lack of emotion in his voice sent a shiver down Tessa's spine. It was a terrifying, violent reality. Yet, looking at the sharp set of his jaw and the fierce, protective loyalty burning beneath his cold exterior, Tessa felt an entirely inappropriate flutter in her chest. She had spent her whole life avoiding dangerous men, only to realize that the most dangerous man in the city was the only one who made her feel entirely safe. Her phone chimed in her lap. The sharp ping shattered the heavy atmosphere. Tessa grabbed it. An unknown number. One text. Tess. It's G Motel 6 on I-95. Room 112. Bring cash. Don't tell Dom. She stared at the screen, her heart hammering. Slowly, she turned the phone and showed the screen to the man sitting beside her. Dominic's eyes scanned the text. A muscle feathered in his jaw. He tapped the glass partition separating them from the driver. Change of plans, Dominic ordered, his voice suddenly hard as flint. We're going to the highway. The motel was a rotting, neon-lit stain on the edge of the interstate. The rain had picked up, turning the parking lot into a murky swamp of oil slicks and overflowing gutters. Stay in the car, Dominic ordered, opening his door. No. Tessa unbuckled her seatbelt. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was surprisingly steady. If they see you coming, they might panic and hurt her. She asked for me. Dominic froze, one foot on the wet pavement. He looked back at her, his dark eyes narrowing. He hated that she was right. You walk in front of me. You do not speak. If anything goes wrong, you drop to the floor. Do you understand me? Yes. They walked through the freezing rain toward room 112. The two guards flanked them, silent and lethal. Tessa's sneakers squelched on the concrete. She felt like she was walking to an execution. She knocked on the peeling green door. Gemma? It's Tessa. A moment later, the door cracked open. Gemma's tear-streaked face appeared in the gap. She looked terrible, her designer makeup smeared, her expensive silk blouse ripped at the collar. Tess, did you bring... Gemma's eyes darted over Tessa's shoulder and landed on Dominic. All the color drained from her face. Before Gemma could slam the door, Dominic's hand shot out, hitting the wood with a violent crack that splintered the frame. He pushed the door wide open, stepping into the dingy room. Tessa stumbled in behind him, gasping. There were two men in the room. One was sitting on the stained bed, counting a stack of bills. The other was standing near the bathroom. They both reached for their waistbands the second the door burst open. They never made it. Dominic moved with a terrifying liquid speed. He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing the man by the bathroom by his throat and slamming him against the drywall with enough force to crack the plaster. The second man lunged, but Dominic's guards were already inside, dragging him to the floor with brutal efficiency. It was over in 5 seconds. Tessa stood frozen near the door, her breath caught in her throat. She watched as Dominic, his face an impassive mask of stone, tightened his grip on the choking man's neck. The man's legs kicked frantically against the wall. "Dominic!" Gemma sobbed from the corner, curling into a ball. Dominic didn't look at his sister. He stared dead into the eyes of the man he was holding off the floor. "If you ever breathe in my sister's direction again, I will peel the skin from your bones. Nod if you understand." The man, face turning a mottled purple, managed a frantic, jerky nod. Dominic dropped him. The man collapsed, coughing violently. Dominic adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket, not a hair out of place. He turned to his men. "Clean this up. Put her in the car." He didn't look at Gemma as she was ushered out. He walked back to Tessa, who was trembling so violently her teeth were chattering. "Look at me," Dominic said, his voice instantly dropping the brutal edge. It was soft, a quiet command. Tessa forced her eyes up. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. She couldn't speak. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving a cold, hollow panic in its wake. She had just seen the monster beneath the suit. She had seen the violence he was capable of. Dominic saw the fear in her eyes. He reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before resting his large, warm hand on the back of her neck. His thumb brushed against her pulse point. "Breathe, Tessa." The touch acted like a live wire. The sheer heat of his hand against her freezing skin grounded her, pulling her out of the spiral of panic. "Let's get you out of here," he murmured. 40 minutes later, they were not at Tessa's cramped studio. They were in Dominic's penthouse, a sprawling fortress in the sky that made Gemma's apartment look like a college dorm. Gemma had been taken to a secure family estate under heavy guard. Tessa stood in the center of Dominic's massive, dimly lit living room. She was still wearing her damp jacket. Dominic walked to a crystal decanter, poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy glass, and walked back to her. He pressed the glass into her hand. "Drink," he instructed. Tessa brought the glass to her lips and took a swallow. The whiskey burned like liquid fire down her throat, making her cough, but it chased away the lingering ice in her veins. Dominic took off his suit jacket, throwing it over a leather armchair. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing thick, corded forearms and a constellation of faded scars. He looked exhausted again. The adrenaline of the violence had bled out of him, leaving him looking intensely human. He sat down on the edge of the coffee table, right in front of where she stood. He looked up at her, elbows resting on his knees. "You're angry," he noted. "I'm terrified," Tessa corrected, her voice finally steadying. She clutched the glass with both hands. "I don't belong here, Dominic. I don't belong in motel rooms with men with guns. I don't belong in penthouses that cost more than my life is worth. I punch a clock. I count pills. You belong wherever you decide to belong," he said softly. "No." Tessa shook her head, tears of pure frustration pricking her eyes. "You don't get it. My whole life I've kept my head down. I built walls so high nobody could get over them. I've never let anyone in. I've never—" She stopped, her cheeks flushing hot. The cynical armor was cracking, falling away piece by piece. Dominic tilted his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. He didn't push, but the silence demanded the truth. "I don't know how to do this," Tessa whispered, the confession tearing out of her. "Any of it. I'm 23 years old, and I've never even let a man see me naked. I've never been touched, because touch means attachment, and attachment means ruin. And now I'm standing here, and the only thing I can think about is the way your hand felt on my neck." The silence in the room became deafening. Tessa squeezed her eyes shut, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her whole. She had just handed him her biggest, most humiliating vulnerability. A mafia boss. A man who dealt in blood and leverage. She heard the scrape of his shoes on the hardwood floor. When she opened her eyes, Dominic was standing mere inches from her. The imposing, terrifying boss was gone. In his place was a man looking at her with a reverence that stole the breath straight from her lungs. He reached out, his knuckles grazing her cheek. His touch was terrifyingly gentle. "You think that makes you weak?" Dominic murmured, his thumb catching a stray tear that escaped her lashes. His voice was a deep, rough rumble that vibrated in her chest. "You think guarding yourself makes you a fool, Tessa? In my world, we lock away the things that are priceless." Tessa shuddered, a full body tremor as he stepped closer, obliterating the space between them. "If you've never been touched," Dominic whispered, leaning down until his lips were a breath away from hers, the scent of cedar and whiskey wrapping around her. "Then we go slow, because I am going to touch you, Tessa. And when I do, I'm never letting you go." Tessa woke up to the smell of roasted coffee beans and rain evaporating off hot asphalt. She was tangled in sheets that felt like liquid silk, a stark contrast to the pilled polyester blends she bought at big box discount stores. For 3 agonizing seconds, her brain served up the comfortable lie that she was in her own bed in Queens, late for a shift. Then she registered the sheer size of the mattress, the heavy, soundproof silence of the room. The events of the previous night crashed into her chest like a physical weight. The motel, the splintered door, the man choking against the drywall. Dominic. Tessa sat up, dragging a hand through her tangled hair. She was wearing a charcoal gray t-shirt that smelled faintly of cedar and expensive laundry detergent. Dominic had given it to her before quietly closing the guest room door, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts. He had kept his word. He hadn't pushed, but the memory of his breath against her lips, his absolute vow to dismantle her walls, left a low, vibrating hum in her veins. She slid out of bed. Her worn sneakers looked pathetic, sitting on the plush Persian rug. She put them on anyway, needing something familiar to ground her. The penthouse was washed in the flat, gray light of mid-morning. Tessa walked down the wide hallway, the soles of her shoes silent on the hardwood. She found him in the kitchen. Dominic was leaning against the marble island, a tablet in one hand and a ceramic mug in the other. He wore dark jeans and a white button-down shirt, untucked, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows. He looked up the second her foot crossed the threshold. The transition in his face was instantaneous. The cold, calculating stare he had directed at the screen melted into something entirely different. It was a look of quiet, absolute focus. "There's coffee in the pot," he said. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet apartment. "And bagels from the place on 8th. Gemma mentioned once that you survive entirely on everything bagels with plain cream cheese." Tessa stopped at the edge of the kitchen. "You remember a passing comment your sister made about my bagel preferences?" "I remember everything about you." He set the tablet down face down on the marble. "Did you sleep?" "No," Tessa lied. She had passed out from sheer exhaustion the moment her head hit the pillow. "Dominic, I need to go home. I need to go to work." "You don't have a job anymore." Tessa froze, her hand hovering over the handle of the coffee pot. She whipped her head around to look at him. "Excuse me?" "I bought the pharmacy this morning," Dominic said, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He said it with the casual indifference of someone announcing they had bought a newspaper. Gary is taking an early retirement. The store is closed for renovations. You are on paid leave indefinitely. A hot, sharp spike of anger pierced through the lingering fear. Tessa marched around the island, stopping 2 feet from him. You can't do that. You can't just buy my life because it's convenient for you. It's not about convenience. It's about keeping you breathing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He simply absorbed her anger like a stone wall taking a wave. The men in that motel room work for the Moretti family. They were trying to leverage Gemma to get to me. They failed. Now they are looking for a weak point. If they find out you were the one Gemma called, they will come to Queens. They will kick down the door of your studio, and they will not care that you are just a civilian. They will use you to hurt me. Tessa stared at him, her chest heaving. The logical part of her brain, the survivalist that had kept her alive for 23 years, knew he was right. But the independent, cynical woman hated it. I am not one of your assets, she said, her voice shaking with the effort to maintain control. I am not a piece on your chessboard. Dominic set his mug down. He stepped into her space, closing the 2 feet between them in a second. He was so close she had to tilt her head back to look him in the eye. You're right, he said softly. He reached out, his knuckles brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was feather-light, completely at odds with the violent reality they were discussing. You're not a pawn, Tessa. You are the only thing in my life that I actually want to protect. Your apartment is compromised. My men are packing up your essentials right now. You are staying here. I don't belong here, she whispered, a desperate plea to logic. Then make room, he replied, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Because I am not letting you out of my sight until the Morettis are buried. The Costa family estate was a fortress disguised as a sprawling Gilded Age mansion on the north shore of Long Island. Tessa sat in the back of the armored SUV, watching the wrought iron gates swing open as they approached. The grounds were immaculate, all manicured hedges and crushed gravel driveways, but the men patrolling the perimeter in dark suits and earpieces ruined the illusion of a peaceful country retreat. Dominic sat beside her, reading a file. He had been silent for the 40-minute drive. He operated in 2 modes, the fiercely protective man who poured her coffee and the cold, unapproachable boss running an empire of violence. Right now, he was the boss. The SUV stopped at the front steps. A man opened the door before the engine even cut completely. Gemma is in the sunroom, boss, the man said, nodding to Dominic. Dominic didn't acknowledge the greeting. He looked at Tessa. 20 minutes, then we leave. Wyatt will stay by the door. He gestured to a heavily scarred, broad-shouldered man standing near the entrance. Wyatt offered Tessa a tight, respectful nod. Tessa stepped out of the car. The air smelled like salt water and money. She walked up the stone steps, acutely aware of the eyes watching her every move. She felt like an imposter in her thrifted jeans and oversized sweater, stepping into a world built on blood and inheritance. She found Gemma in a glass-enclosed room overlooking the gray, churning waters of the Sound. Gemma was curled up on a floral chaise lounge, clutching a throw pillow like a life raft. She looked incredibly small. "Tess!" Gemma gasped, scrambling off the lounge and throwing her arms around Tessa. Tessa hugged her back, feeling the sharp, protruding bones of her friend's shoulders. "Are you okay, Gem? Did they hurt you?" No, just scared me. Gemma pulled back, wiping a mascara-smudged tear from her cheek. I'm so stupid. I owed 40 grand to a bookie. I didn't know he was kicking up to the Morettis. I swear, Tess, I didn't know. It's over, Tessa said softly, leading Gemma back to the sofa. Dominic is handling it. At the mention of her brother's name, Gemma flinched. She looked at Tessa, really looked at her eyes darting over Tessa's face and the oversized sweater that clearly belonged to a very large man. He kept you with him, Gemma stated. It wasn't a question. Tessa shifted uncomfortably. My apartment isn't safe. Gemma shook her head slowly, a sudden, sharp clarity breaking through her panic. There are a dozen safe houses in the city, Tess. Condos with 24-hour guards. He took you to the penthouse. He took you to his home. Dominic doesn't bring anyone to the penthouse. He's just being cautious. Don't be naive, Gemma snapped, her voice suddenly fierce. She grabbed Tessa's hands, squeezing them tight. Look at me. I love you. You are the sister I actually chose. But you need to understand what my brother is. He isn't a normal man. He doesn't feel things in normal ways. He doesn't get crushes. He obsesses. He claims things. If he has decided you belong to him, he will burn down the city to keep you. A cold chill ran down Tessa's spine. It mirrored the terrifying promise Dominic had made to her just last night. I can handle him, Tessa said, though her voice lacked conviction. You can handle the man, Gemma corrected bitterly. Can you handle the life? Can you handle knowing the suit he wears to dinner might have someone else's blood on the cuffs? Because that's the reality, Tess. I was born into this cage. You are walking into it willingly. Before Tessa could formulate a response, the heavy wooden door of the sunroom clicked open. Dominic stood in the doorway. The air in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees. He didn't look at his sister. His gaze was fixed entirely on Tessa. Time to go, he said. It wasn't a request. Tessa squeezed Gemma's hands one last time, a silent promise that they weren't done talking, and stood up. She walked toward Dominic. As she passed him, she caught the faint, metallic scent of ozone and something sharper underneath the cedar. She glanced down. There was a tiny rust-colored speck on the stark white cuff of his shirt. Blood. He caught her looking. He didn't hide his wrist. He simply adjusted his cufflink, his eyes locking with hers, challenging her to flinch. Tessa didn't flinch. She squared her shoulders and walked past him into the hallway. The cage was closing, and the terrifying part wasn't the lock. The terrifying part was that she was beginning to want the man holding the key. By the time they returned to the city, the sun had set, plunging the penthouse into a moody, shadow-drenched stillness. Tessa stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room, staring out at the grid of city lights. The reflection in the glass showed a stranger. She looked tired, small, and entirely out of her depth. Gemma's words echoed relentlessly in her skull. He obsesses. He claims things. Can you handle the life? She heard the soft clink of a glass behind her. She didn't turn around. You've been quiet since Long Island, Dominic said. His reflection joined hers in the glass. He stood a few feet behind her, having stripped off his suit jacket and tie. The white shirt, the one with the stained cuff, was gone, replaced by a dark, simple t-shirt. Gemma thinks I'm an idiot, Tessa said, her voice flat, bouncing off the thick glass. Gemma thinks about herself. It's a survival mechanism she developed when my father was alive. Dominic stepped closer. The proximity made the hairs on Tessa's arms stand up. What do you think, Tessa? I think I'm standing in a $60 million apartment because a cartel wants to use me as bait. She finally turned around, facing him. The cynical armor was fully strapped on, a desperate attempt to protect the vulnerable core he had exposed the night before. I think you bought my employer to control my movements. I think I saw blood on your sleeve today. Dominic didn't deny it. He took a sip of his bourbon, his dark eyes unreadable. Arthur Moretti sent a scout to the perimeter of the estate. The scout was dealt with. Dealt with, Tessa repeated, the euphemism tasting like ash in her mouth. Did you kill him? No. I broke his collarbone and sent him back to Arthur with a message. Dominic set his glass down on a side table. He closed the distance between them, stopping mere inches away. This is who I am. I do not hide the violence from you, because the violence is what keeps the monsters at the door. I will not apologize for protecting what is mine. I am not yours, Tessa shot back, her voice shaking with sudden, fierce emotion. I am 23 years old. I've spent my entire life making sure nobody owned me. I don't owe you anything just because you decided to play knight in bloody armor. She expected him to get angry. She wanted him to get angry. Anger was easy to fight. Instead, Dominic looked at her with a profound, terrifying tenderness. He raised his hands, palms open, a gesture of complete surrender. You don't owe me anything, he agreed softly. You never will. He lowered his hands, letting them rest gently on her hips. The contact sent a violent jolt of electricity straight to her core. Tessa gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to rest against his chest. Beneath the thin cotton of his shirt, she could feel the steady, heavy beat of his heart. I promised you we would go slow, Dominic murmured, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. But you need to understand, Tessa. The walls you built kept the wrong men out. They won't keep me out, because I don't want to break them down. I want to stand guard outside them, so you never have to be afraid again. Tessa closed her eyes, a ragged breath tearing through her lungs. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a heavy, aching vulnerability. She was so tired of fighting. She was so tired of being alone. I don't know how to do this, she confessed again. The same terrified admission from the night before. But this time, it felt heavier, more real. I don't know the rules. There are no rules, Dominic said. He slid one hand from her hip, tangling his fingers in the hair at the nape of her neck. He tilted her head up. You dictate the pace. You tell me to stop, I stop. You tell me to walk away, I will tear my own heart out and leave it at your feet, but I will walk away. He was giving her all the power. The dangerous, lethal boss of the Costa family was laying his entire hand on the table, offering her the one thing she prized above all else: control. Tessa opened her eyes. She looked at the brutal, beautiful lines of his face. She thought about her mother, ruined by weak men who took and took. Dominic wasn't taking. He was offering. She made her choice. Slowly, deliberately, Tessa slid her hands up his chest, wrapping her arms around his neck. She didn't look away. Don't walk away. A low groan vibrated in Dominic's chest, a sound of absolute reverence and suppressed hunger. He didn't hesitate anymore. He closed the remaining fraction of an inch between them, capturing her lips with his. Tessa's entire world narrowed to a pinpoint of heat and sensation. She had expected the kiss to be demanding, a violent, claiming fitting for a man of his world. But it wasn't. It was painfully gentle. He kissed her as if she were made of spun glass, his lips moving against hers with a slow, deliberate worship. The hesitation that had gripped her spine evaporated. Tessa melted against him, her mouth parting, inviting him in. The taste of bourbon and mint flooded her senses. The sheer size of him, the hard muscles beneath her hands, should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like dropping anchor in the middle of a hurricane. Dominic's hands tightened on her waist, pulling her flush against him. He deepened the kiss, a slow escalation of heat that sent a flush rising across her chest. Tessa's fingers dug into the hair at the back of his head, a soft, involuntary sigh escaping her lips. He broke the kiss slowly, resting his forehead against hers. They were both breathing heavily, the silence of the penthouse amplifying the sound of their ragged breaths. "You're shaking," Dominic whispered, his thumb brushing across her flushed cheek. "I'm not scared," Tessa replied immediately, and realized with a shock that it was the absolute truth. "I know," he said, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly against his chest, tucking her head under his chin. "I know, mia vita." Tessa closed her eyes, resting her cheek against his chest, listening to the steady thud of his heart. She had let the monster in. She had lowered the drawbridge and invited the darkness inside. But as his arms held her tight against the terrifying reality of his world, Tessa realized the most dangerous thing wasn't the Moretti family or the blood on his cuff. The most dangerous thing was that she was falling completely, hopelessly in love with him. And in a world built on leverage, a heart was the easiest thing to break. The penthouse became a beautiful, terrifying purgatory. For 3 days, it rained. The city below was a gray, smeared canvas of umbrellas and brake lights, completely disconnected from the soundproofed, climate-controlled silence of Dominic's world. Tessa adapted, because adapting was what she did best. She learned the rhythms of a war fought from a distance. Dominic barely slept. He spent hours in his study, the heavy oak door shut, his voice a low, authoritative murmur bleeding through the wood. Men in dark suits came and went, their faces grim, their coats smelling of wet wool and stale cigarette smoke. Wyatt, the scarred guard, became a permanent fixture by the front door, a silent monolith who only spoke to offer Tessa bottled water or confirm that the perimeter was secure. Dominic kept his promise. He didn't push her into a physical relationship. He didn't crowd her. But his presence was a constant, heavy blanket wrapping around her. He would emerge from his study, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, and find her reading on the velvet sofa. He wouldn't say a word. He would just sit beside her, pull her legs into his lap, and rest his hand on her ankle while he reviewed ledgers on his tablet. That casual, possessive touch did more to dismantle her defenses than 1,000 grand declarations. It was an anchor. It was the quiet, undeniable proof that in the middle of dismantling a rival syndicate, she was his grounding wire. On the 4th morning, the illusion of safety shattered. Tessa was in the kitchen, slicing apples, trying to find a mundane task to quiet the buzzing anxiety in her chest. The elevator chimed, a sharp, piercing sound that rarely happened without Wyatt giving prior notice. Wyatt stepped into the foyer. He wasn't holding his usual tablet. He was holding a small brown cardboard box. He looked grim. Dominic walked out of his study before Wyatt could even announce himself. He took one look at the box, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The gentle, exhausted man who had kissed Tessa's forehead an hour ago vanished. The monster returned, his spine snapping straight, his eyes turning to flat, dead asphalt. "Scan it," Dominic ordered. "Already done, boss. No explosives. No chemicals," Wyatt said, his voice tight. It was left at the service entrance, addressed to her. Tessa froze, the paring knife slipping from her fingers and clattering against the marble counter. She wiped her hands on her jeans, her heart kicking into a frantic rhythm. "Me?" Dominic stepped between her and the box. "Open it, Wyatt." Wyatt pulled a tactical knife from his belt, sliced the packing tape, and flipped the cardboard flaps open. He looked inside, his jaw tightening, before tilting the box so Dominic could see. Dominic didn't flinch, but a muscle feathered violently along his jawline. He reached into the box and pulled out a small plastic rectangle. He turned around and placed it on the marble island in front of Tessa. It was her blue plastic name tag from the pharmacy. Tessa, lead technician. The white lettering was smeared with a dark, rust-colored substance. Dried blood. Tessa stared at it. The air in her lungs turned to ice. "Gary," she whispered, the name tearing out of her throat. The sweet, terrified pharmacist who had let her leave early. The man who brought donuts on Fridays. "Wyatt, call the precinct," Dominic snapped, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Find out what happened at the pharmacy on 4th and Elm last night." Wyatt nodded and stepped away, pressing an earpiece deep into his ear. Tessa gripped the edge of the marble counter, her knuckles turning white. The room began to spin. "They hurt him. Because of me. Because I work there." "Look at me," Dominic commanded. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip firm enough to ground her, pulling her out of the spiraling panic. "Do not take this on. This is Arthur Moretti. This is his methodology. He hits civilians to force a mistake." "Is he dead, Dominic?" Tessa demanded, her voice cracking. Tears of pure, hot guilt pricked her eyes. "Tell me the truth." Wyatt stepped back into the kitchen. "Boss, arson. The pharmacy burned to the ground at 3 a.m. Gary was inside doing inventory. He's in the ICU at Mount Sinai. Smoke inhalation and blunt force trauma. He's critical." A sob ripped from Tessa's throat. She clamped a hand over her mouth, stumbling backward. The walls of the penthouse felt like they were closing in. Her armor, her careful, calculated life of invisibility, had protected her, but it hadn't protected the people around her. "I have to go to the hospital," she choked out, turning blindly toward the hallway. "No." Dominic caught her arm, spinning her back around. "That is exactly what Arthur wants. He expects you to break cover. He expects you to show up at that hospital so his men can grab you and put a gun to your head. You are not leaving this building." "I can't just sit here," Tessa screamed, shoving at his chest. The raw, cynical fight in her exploded to the surface. "He's dying because of me, because your sister couldn't pay her debts, and you dragged me into this." Dominic took the shove. He didn't move an inch. He let her hit him again, her fists pounding uselessly against his solid chest, until her anger broke into violent, shaking sobs. He wrapped his arms around her, crushing her against him, burying his face in her hair. "I know," he whispered fiercely, his voice a dark, jagged vow. "I know, Tessa, but I am not losing you." He held her until the shaking stopped, until the tears dried into a hollow, aching numbness. Then he pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. "Wyatt is going to lock down this floor," Dominic said, his tone shifting into pure, lethal command. "Nobody comes in, nobody goes out. I am taking 50 men, and I am going to find Arthur Moretti. I am going to cut the head off this snake tonight." Tessa looked at his face. She saw the absolute, terrifying violence brewing behind his eyes. She didn't ask him to show mercy. She didn't ask him to spare them. The world had just shown her its teeth, and for the first time in her life, she wanted the monster to bite back. "Kill him," Tessa whispered, her voice cold and dead. Dominic's eyes widened slightly at the darkness in her tone. Then a dark, devastating pride flashed across his face. He kissed her, hard, desperate, a bruising clash of teeth and breath that tasted of salt and promises. "I will be back before dawn," he swore against her lips. He let go of her, grabbed his coat from Wyatt, and walked out the door. The heavy deadbolts clicked shut behind him, sealing Tessa in the vault. Midnight came and went. The penthouse was suffocatingly quiet. Tessa paced the length of the living room, her bare feet making no sound on the rugs. The adrenaline of the morning had faded into a cold, nauseating dread. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every creak of the building settling sounded like a gunshot. Wyatt stood by the heavy front doors, an assault rifle resting casually across his chest. He hadn't moved in 4 hours. At 1:14 a.m., the lights flickered. Tessa stopped pacing. She looked up at the crystal chandelier. It dimmed, surged brightly, and then died completely. The hum of the climate control faded into silence. The entire penthouse plunged into absolute darkness. "Wyatt," Tessa called out, her voice trembling. "Get down," Wyatt barked. The sound of a heavy safety clicking off echoed in the dark. "Behind the sofa, now." Tessa didn't ask questions. She dropped to her hands and knees, scrambling behind the massive velvet couch, making herself as small as possible. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The heavy thud of boots sounded in the hallway outside the penthouse. Someone was out there. A deafening boom shook the floorboards. The heavy oak double doors, reinforced with steel, shuddered violently. They were blowing the hinges. "Tessa, cover your ears!" Wyatt yelled. Another explosion ripped through the air, showering the dark foyer in splinters and dust. The doors caved inward. Flashlights cut through the smoke, blindingly bright. Wyatt opened fire. The deafening roar of the assault rifle in the enclosed space was agonizing. Tessa pressed her hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut, screaming into her knees. The smell of sulfur, pulverized drywall, and copper instantly choked the air. Return fire shredded the living room. Glass shattered. The crystal chandelier rained down in a million sharp fragments. The velvet sofa above Tessa jerked as bullets tore through the upholstery, showering her in foam and feathers. "Move up! Suppressing fire!" a voice yelled from the hallway. Tessa opened her eyes. Through the gap between the sofa and the floor, she saw Wyatt. He was pinned behind a marble pillar, reloading with terrifying speed. He looked over at her, his face illuminated by the muzzle flashes. "Run to the hallway!" Wyatt roared over the gunfire. "The panic room! Go!" Tessa didn't want to move. Her brain was screaming at her to stay perfectly still, to play dead. But survival instinct, honed over 23 years of fighting for every scrap of air she breathed, took over. She crawled on her belly, ignoring the glass slicing into her forearms until she reached the edge of the sofa. She scrambled to her feet and sprinted blindly toward the dark hallway. A bullet slammed into the drywall inches from her head, showering her hair in white dust. She screamed, throwing herself around the corner. She hit the floor hard, bruising her hip, and scrambled backward until her back hit the steel door of the panic room. She reached up, her bloody fingers slipping on the biometric keypad Dominic had programmed her thumbprint into 2 days ago. Access denied. No, 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 Tessa sobbed, wiping her thumb on her jeans, smearing her own blood, and pressing it again. Access denied. The system was offline due to the power cut. She needed the physical key. She didn't have it. The gunfire in the living room abruptly stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the apartment. Tessa stopped breathing. She pressed herself flat against the steel door, trapped in the narrow hallway. "Check the guard," a rough voice ordered from the living room. "Find the girl. Arthur wants her breathing, but he didn't say she needs all her limbs." Heavy footsteps crunched on the broken glass, moving slowly toward the hallway. The beam of a flashlight swept across the wall, inching closer to the corner where Tessa was hiding. Tessa looked around frantically. Nothing, no weapons, no escape. This was it. The fairy tale was ending exactly how her cynical mind always knew it would, in blood and terror. The beam of light rounded the corner, catching her face. "Found her," a man said, stepping into the hallway. He lowered his gun, pulling a zip tie from his vest. He smiled. It was a nasty, triumphant smile. Before the man could take another step, a shadow detached itself from the gloom behind him. A hand, large and clad in a leather tactical glove, clamped over the man's mouth. A second hand wrapped around his throat. There was a sickening wet snap. The man collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. Dominic stood over the body. He looked like a demon dragged straight from hell. His dark suit was ruined, torn and soaked black with blood. His face was smeared with ash and crimson. He held a suppressed handgun in his right hand. He didn't say a word. He stepped over the dead man, looking down the hallway at Tessa. His chest was heaving. His eyes were wild, frantic, scanning her up and down for bullet holes. 3 more men rushed into the hallway behind him. Dominic didn't even turn his head. He raised his gun backward and fired 3 silent, muffled shots. 3 bodies hit the floor. He holstered the weapon, his hands shaking slightly as he dropped to his knees in front of her. Tessa stared at him. She was covered in drywall dust, her arms bleeding from the glass, shivering uncontrollably. This was the moment she should run. This was the monster Gemma had warned her about. The butcher covered in the blood of his enemies, surrounded by corpses in his own home. But as Dominic reached out, his bloody hands hovering inches from her face, terrified to touch her, terrified he would taint her, Tessa didn't see a monster. She saw the man who had torn the city apart to get back to her. Tessa lunged forward, throwing her arms around his neck, burying her face in the crook of his shoulder. The smell of gunpowder and blood was overwhelming, but she breathed it in like oxygen. Dominic let out a broken, ragged exhale. His massive arms wrapped around her, crushing her against his chest, burying his face in her dusty hair. He held her so tightly her ribs ached, rocking her gently back and forth on the floor of the ruined hallway. "I've got you," he whispered hoarsely, kissing the side of her head, her temple, her cheek. "I've got you, Tessa. They're all dead. It's over." The safe house was a fortified concrete bunker beneath a nondescript warehouse in Brooklyn. It lacked the floor-to-ceiling windows and marble counters of the penthouse. But right now, the thick steel walls were the most beautiful thing Tessa had ever seen. The adrenaline had finally bled out, leaving a bone-deep, trembling exhaustion in its wake. Wyatt was in the medical bay, getting a bullet grazed stitched on his shoulder. Dominic and Tessa were alone in the master quarters. The room was sparsely furnished, a heavy oak bed, a small bathroom, and a stark fluorescent light hanging from the ceiling. Dominic stood by the edge of the bed. He was stripping off his ruined clothes. He moved stiffly, wincing as he pulled his bloody suit jacket down his arms. Tessa sat on the mattress, a damp towel in her hands. She watched him. The cynical girl who averted her eyes from the world was gone. She stared openly at the map of violence etched into his skin. Old scars crisscrossed his ribs and back. New bruises were already blooming purple and black along his left side. He pulled the ruined dress shirt over his head, dropping it onto the concrete floor. He stood before her, entirely bare-chested, vulnerable, and brutalized. "Gary is going to live," Dominic said quietly, not looking at her. He stared at his own bloody hands. "Arthur Moretti is dead. His lieutenants are dead. The remaining crew is fleeing the city. No one will ever look at you, or Gemma, or anyone you care about again." Tessa stood up. She walked over to him, the damp towel gripped in her hands. "You're hurt," she noted, her voice steady. "I've been worse," he replied, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were shadowed with doubt. He had shown her the absolute worst of his world tonight. He was waiting for the revulsion. He was waiting for her to ask to leave. Tessa didn't ask to leave. She reached up and pressed the warm, damp towel to a smear of dried blood on his cheekbone. She wiped it away with slow, deliberate care. Dominic's breath hitched. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a starving man finding bread. She cleaned his face, the strong column of his neck, the broad expanse of his chest. She wiped away the ash, the sweat, and the blood of other men. With every stroke of the towel, the invisible wall between them crumbled a little more, until there was nothing left but skin and truth. "You told me to dictate the pace," Tessa whispered, tracing the edge of an old scar over his collarbone with her bare thumb. Dominic opened his eyes. They were dark, entirely focused on her. "I did. I'm tired of waiting," she said, dropping the towel to the floor. "I'm tired of being afraid." Dominic's hands came up, resting lightly on her waist. He didn't rush. He looked at her with that same terrifying reverence he had shown her in the penthouse. But now it was forged in fire. "Are you sure, Tessa? Once I cross this line, there is no going back. You belong to me, and I belong to you. Forever." "I crossed the line the moment you stepped out of the shadows in Gemma's apartment," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. Dominic didn't need anything else. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't the gentle, hesitant kiss of a man trying not to scare her. It was a claiming. It was deep, desperate, and devastatingly thorough. Tessa opened her mouth to him, tangling her hands in his dark hair, pulling him closer. He lifted her off her feet with effortless strength, carrying her the 2 steps to the bed. He laid her down gently on the heavy quilt, following her down, caging her beneath his body. He undressed her with slow, agonizing care. He treated her thrift store clothes like they were spun from gold, tossing them aside until there was nothing between them but the cool air of the bunker. Tessa shivered, her cheeks flushing hot under his intense, heavy gaze. "You are so beautiful," he murmured, his voice a rough scrape against the silence. He kept his promise. He went incredibly slow. Every touch was an exploration, every kiss a reassurance. He mapped the contours of her body with his mouth and his hands, tearing down the last of her cynical armor, making her feel things she had spent 23 years convincing herself she didn't need. When the pain came, it was a brief, sharp pinch, eclipsed entirely by the overwhelming fullness of him. Dominic stopped immediately, his jaw clenched tight, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple as he held himself perfectly still above her. "Tessa," he breathed, waiting. She looked up at the brutal, beautiful face of the man who had burned an empire to the ground to keep her safe. She wrapped her arms tightly around his broad back, pulling him down against her chest. "Don't stop," she whispered fiercely. He didn't. The pain melted into a heavy, consuming heat, a relentless rhythm that dragged Tessa out of the shadows of her life and into a blinding, terrifying light. She clung to him, whispering his name as the world fractured around her, rebuilding itself into a reality where she was no longer invisible. Hours later, the bunker was quiet. Tessa lay curled against Dominic's side, her head resting on his chest, her bare leg draped over his hips. His heavy arm was wrapped securely around her waist, his hand resting possessively over her hip bone. He was sound asleep, the exhaustion finally pulling him under. Tessa stared at the concrete ceiling, listening to the steady, rhythmic beating of his heart beneath her ear. Gemma had been wrong. Dominic hadn't built a cage for her. He had built a fortress. He was the king of a violent, bloody world, but he had placed the crown directly onto her head. She was 23 years old, and she wasn't a virgin hiding behind a pharmacy counter anymore. She was Tessa Costa. And God help anyone who ever tried to touch her king. Thank you so much for joining us on this dark, thrilling journey with Tessa and Dominic. If their fierce loyalty, slow burn romance, and explosive action kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Let us know your favorite moment in the comments below. Did you love the intense penthouse showdown or their emotional bunker confession? Don't forget to share this story with your fellow Mafia romance addicts and subscribe to the channel for more gripping, heart-pounding audio dramas. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our next obsession.